Well, I want to touch on ADD because I have been diagnosed with ADD. You have. Yeah. How many people in the room would admit or think they have ADD, right? And I've heard you talk about in your book, Scattered, that ADD is a response to trauma.
Yes, it is.
What does that mean?
Well, first of all, let me make a point that occurred to me when you were talking about your marijuana use and your cocaine use. Those are typical self-medications for ADD. Mm-hmm. Because the marijuana calms down the hyperactive mind. And if you get treated for ADD, what do they give you? They give you a stimulant, which elevates dopamine levels in the brain. Well, what do you think cocaine is? It's a stimulant. It elevates dopamine levels. So the point I'm making is that a lot of addictions are actually self-medications for specific conditions, right? Like in your case. Now, ADD. Again, the medical mantra around ADD, and I was diagnosed in my 50s, and two of my children were diagnosed afterwards. The medical mantra is that it's a genetic brain disease. Well, it isn't genetic, and it's not a brain disease. When you look at the tuning out, the absent-mindedness of ADD, why do we have that capacity to tune out, do you think? Nature gives us that capacity. We all have that capacity to dissociate, to tune out. Why? Well, it's very simple. If I were to threaten you right now, stress you, abuse you verbally, you would, the number of options available to you, one would be to get up and leave, which is called flight. Or you could stand up and assert yourself and tell me to stop, which is called fight. And if you couldn't do either, given that, how many hundreds of people are here?
There's about 400 between both rooms.
Okay, so there's 400 people here. You could ask for help. Those would be the functional options. But what if you couldn't escape because you're too small and powerless? What if you couldn't fight back for the same reason? And what if there's nobody to ask for help? Then what would you do? Well, you wouldn't do anything. Your brain would go into an automatic dissociative mode to protect you from the distress. So that's what it is. It's an adaptation to overwhelming stress. Now, if you put me back into my first year of life, and there are times in the first year of life when every second, like in this space of time, and millions of connections are being made in the brain. What's happening in my first year of life? My mother is stressed. The day after the German army marches into Budapest, when I am 2 months of age, she calls the pediatrician to say, would you please come and see Gabor, because he's crying all the time. And the pediatrician says, well, of course I'll come and see him, but I should tell you, all my Jewish babies are crying. Now, why are Jewish babies crying? Well, not because I know anything about Hitler or genocide, but because I'm picking up on my mother's stress. And there's a quote here from one of my teachers that I'd like to read to you, if I can find it. And it says that the child is very open and can feel the pain and suffering going on in its immediate environment. The child is aware of its own body and can also feel the tension, rigidity, and pain in the body of the mother or of anyone else he's with. If the mother is suffering, the baby suffers too. The pain never gets discharged. So let's say, what do I do then when my mother is depressed and stressed and terrorized? How do I deal with it? Can I fight back, escape, and ask for help from whom? I tune out. But then the tuning out becomes programmed into my brain. And then 55 years later, or 50 years later, I'm diagnosed with ADHD or ADD. Now, what I'm saying is that and I wasn't abused. Nobody abused me. I just had a depressed and fearful mother. And being a very sensitive, and the more sensitive you are, the more you pick up on that. Mm-hmm. So in those ADD, and if you look at it, it's an adaptation. It begins as an adaptation, which later on becomes a problem. So I'm not saying it's great, I'm saying that it begins as an adaptation, which then becomes a problem. That's the nature. These early adaptations, which children employ, not consciously, to protect themselves from stress, actually become problems later on. Now, if you look at the question of why between 2002 and 2013, I'm being approximate here, the rate of ADD diagnosis in American kids has gone up threefold. What's going on? What's going on is that the parenting environment has become increasingly stressed for all kinds of reasons. And when the parenting environment is stressed, the kids are stressed. And how do they cope with it? They tune out when the brains are developing. Now they're getting diagnosed and medicated and all this mental health crisis. And what we're not looking at is what is it about the environment that actually fosters or foments that response in children. And I'm only talking about ADD. We could talk about anxiety.
Right.
Because people who are addicted often self-medicate anxiety. They self-medicate it with work, with sex, with TV, with distractions, and of course with drugs. And the New York Times Magazine 2 weeks ago had an article about the burgeoning rate of anxiety in American teenagers, and apparently a third now of teenagers and adults in the United States suffer from anxiety. And why? Well, if it was genetic, it wouldn't be increasing, because genes don't change in a population over 10 years or 20 years or even 100 years. What's happening is that the conditions in which children are growing up is getting more and more stressful, and that has to do with the stress on the parents. And that also has to do, of course, with the workaholism of the parents, like in my case. You know, the world thought I was great. I was out there delivering babies and helping the dying, palliative care, and everything else in between. But what of me did my children receive? Not very much. Because I was always trying to validate myself out there in the world. So then I pass on my trauma to them. But I passed it on not genetically, but through the conditions that obtained in my home when my kids were small.
Yeah. So how does ADD and ADHD develop?
Yeah. So ADHD is said in medical terminology to be the most heritable mental health illness, mental disease. Well, in this book, I make the point that to say that ADD is the most heritable mental condition is like saying that quartz is the most chewable crystal. Because it's neither a disease nor is it inherited. So go back to your childhood, you're being abused. Go back to my childhood, the wartime, persecution, all the things. As I said earlier, could we have escaped? No. Could we have changed the situation? No. Could we have fought back? No. What does the mind do when it's under too much stress? One of the things it does is automatically tunes out. So the tuning out, but this is when the brain is developing. The human brain develops from in utero to adulthood, and already stresses on the mother during pregnancy can affect the brain of the child. So if a mother is very stressed or depressed during pregnancy, that kid is already at risk for ADHD later on. It's got nothing to do with genetics, or very little to do with genetics, let me put it that way. So the tuning out is simply one of these natural protections, one of these automatic, wise dynamics on the part of your organism to protect yourself from stress that's too much. Now, what you have to understand again is that the human brain biologically develops under the impact of the environment, and as an article from the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, which is the world's most prestigious child developmental organization, published in the Journal of Pediatrics, which is the official journal of the American Pediatric Academy, in February 2012, pointed out, the human brain develops from in utero until adulthood, and the most important input into the physiological, healthy development of the human brain is the quality of adult-child relationships. So we're relational creatures, which is again is what your work is all about, and our brain itself develops under the impact of our emotional interactions with our parents. Now, if you look at why more and more kids are being diagnosed with this condition, it can't be genetics. Genes don't change in 10 or 20 or 15 years. Now that we're seeing ADHD in countries that never used to have it under the impact of corporate globalization, it's because parents are more and more stressed in this world. They're more and more isolated. And when parents are stressed and isolated, and by the way, we were never meant to be parented in nuclear families by a couple or perhaps a single parent. We evolved for millions of years and hundreds of thousands of years. And even in the existence of our own species, we've been here for about 150, 200,000 years. If our species' existence can be measured in 1 hour, then until 6 minutes ago, we lived in small band hunter-gatherer groups where parents had support from other people, where the kids were with the parents the whole day, where kids developed in the context of adult relationships. That's our need. So in this society, which is more and more stressed, and if you look at the triggers for stress, these are the research-proven triggers for stress in people. It's uncertainty, lack of information, loss of control, and conflict. Our society could not be better designed to stress people. So parents are stressed, not their own fault. Not their own fault. They're stressed. The kids are stressed. When the parents are stressed, you can measure the kids' stress hormone levels. They'll be elevated. Now, how do kids deal with that stress? They tune out. And now they're being diagnosed with this so-called disease. It does have a biological template in the brain because the biology of the brain develops in interaction with the environment. So sometimes medications can help, but they're not the answer. The answer is to change the atmosphere so kids can develop in a healthier way so they can feel safe. And when that happens, the brain will start developing in healthier ways. So ADHD is not this disease inherited otherwise. It's actually a response to stressful circumstances in this culture, despite the best efforts of parents. And the way to really deal with it is not to medicate these millions of kids and to try and just control their behaviors, but to try to understand what's happening for them.